The Jade Moon was unlike any celestial body Earth's explorers had ever encountered. Floating high in the night sky of this alien world, it cast a verdant glow across the dense, surreal forests, where luminescent flora hummed with an eerie beauty. The greenish light bounced off the thick canopy, illuminating the entire jungle floor in a dim, otherworldly glow. Commander Isaac Hayes tightened his grip on his scanner, its tiny light pulsing as he and his team moved cautiously forward, drinking in the strange beauty of this new world. Isaac, with his years of deep space exploration, knew how to recognize something extraordinary, and this place, known to Earth scientists only as Lunar 9, was a find that defied explanation. It was said that there was an intelligent species living here, something unique, unlike anything humanity had encountered. The orders were simple but daunting. Make peaceful contact, observe their society, and report back. The four-person team with him moved through the dense foliage with a mix of awe and apprehension. He caught sight of Dr. Hannah Lee, their lead biologist, gazing in open wonder at a bioluminescent vine that seemed to follow her movement. Everything in this forest pulsed with life, reacting to their presence in delicate, graceful waves of green and blue. Suddenly, Isaac felt the weight of a gaze on him, a sensation not uncommon to seasoned explorers, but this was different. A soft rustling nearby told him that someone, or something, was watching. He slowed his steps, holding up a hand to silence his team. His gaze darted through the trees, catching a glimpse of something strange and captivating. A figure emerged, almost camouflaged by the forest's glow. She was tall, her silhouette graceful and ethereal, with skin that seemed to shimmer in response to the Jade Moon's light. Her eyes were a deep, vivid green that mirrored the moon above, watching him with a curiosity that was both intense and innocent. Isaac's breath caught as he realized he was face to face with one of the planet's native inhabitants. Her gaze flickered between him and his team, unafraid but keenly observant. "Hello," Isaac said, his voice quiet but resonant, attempting a gentle, non-threatening tone. He placed his hand on his chest, a gesture of greeting he'd used in other first contact situations. She blinked, her head tilting slightly, mimicking his gesture as she placed her own hand on her chest. Her fingers, long and slender, brushed against her skin with a fluid, almost magnetic grace. Though she didn't speak, there was an understanding in her gaze, as if she grasped his intention even if the language was foreign to her. As he took a cautious step forward, she watched him intently, but did not withdraw. For several heartbeats, they simply studied one another, and Isaac felt a powerful sense of peace mixed with wonder. Here she was, a living, breathing symbol of the unknown. Just as he opened his mouth to speak again, one of his teammates shifted behind him, snapping a twig beneath his boot. The sound startled her. Her gaze darted to the movement, and in a blink, she melted back into the shadows, her form blending into the bioluminescent landscape. "Commander," Dr. Lee whispered, her voice both awed and concerned. Isaac shook his head, signaling for silence. "She's gone," he said, but his voice was full of awe. "But we made contact." The rest of the day was uneventful, and Isaac's mind kept drifting back to the encounter. That night, as his team settled in their camp, nestled under a grove of softly glowing trees, he found himself staring up at the Jade Moon, lost in thought. The creature, with her graceful movements and those mesmerizing green eyes, had been like nothing he'd ever seen. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a fleeting encounter. Around midnight, when the others had fallen asleep, he felt the familiar prickle of being watched. Isaac scanned the tree line, his pulse quickening as he searched for movement in the shadows. And there, standing on the edge of the clearing, was the alien woman. This time, he approached her slowly, his steps deliberate. She didn't move, watching him with that same piercing curiosity. Isaac noted how she seemed to draw light to her, her skin glistening like it was absorbing the moon's glow. "I don't know if you can understand me," he began softly, "but I'd like to try to communicate. My name is Isaac." He pointed to himself, repeating, "Isaac." She tilted her head, her lips parting slightly, then pointed a slender finger back at him, her eyes narrowing as she seemed to test the name in her mind. "Isaac," she murmured, her voice soft but clear, resonating with an otherworldly tone that seemed to blend with the night's hum. It was a single word, but it held layers of curiosity, perhaps even amusement. Then she pointed to herself, and though she didn't speak aloud, he sensed her name in his mind, as if she'd projected it directly into his thoughts. Mira. Mira, he repeated, tasting the name. She gave the smallest nod, as if pleased. Encouraged, Isaac gestured to the trees and sky, speaking slowly and clearly. Mira's gaze followed his every movement, and she occasionally mimicked him, her curiosity palpable. As they shared this rudimentary conversation, he showed her images from a small device, a hologram of Earth, their planet glowing a soft blue against the darkness of space. Mira reached out, her fingers passing through the hologram, a look of wonder crossing her face. The hours slipped by in a dance of gestures and expressions, with Mira mimicking his laugh when he chuckled, mirroring his smile when he grinned at her curiosity. Though they didn't share a spoken language, their connection grew with each unspoken word. Isaac felt something profound stirring within him, a bond that went beyond mere fascination. Mira drew close, extending a hand to him. Isaac hesitated, then reached out, feeling her fingers slide over his. Her skin was cool and smooth, yet there was an electric warmth to her touch that made his pulse quicken. Mira's face softened, and in that moment, he sensed a shared emotion that bridged the gap between their worlds. Curiosity mingled with a subtle longing neither had expected. Isaac's breath caught as he felt Mira's cool fingers resting against his own, delicate yet steady, as though she were grounding him in this surreal moment. Beneath the quiet pulse of the alien forest, there was a growing sense of warmth, a spark of understanding that went beyond words. Mira's gaze softened as she studied him, her eyes reflecting the Jade Moon above. Then, with a small but certain movement, she guided his hand to her cheek, pressing her face against his palm. Isaac felt his pulse race at her closeness. There was an intimacy in her gesture, a vulnerability that he hadn't expected. Here was a creature so alien, yet he felt as though he was touching a kindred spirit. "Isaac," she murmured, her voice more confident now, yet still carrying that ethereal, melodic quality. He managed a small, warm smile, whispering, "Mira." They stood in silence for a long moment, locked in a world of unspoken connection. She reached out to brush her fingers along his face, her expression a mixture of curiosity and fascination. Each touch, each gentle brush of her hand seemed to say, "Who are you? What are you?" Slowly Mira released him, stepping back, her gaze still locked onto his as if she were memorizing every line, every feature. He felt a pang of disappointment as the connection broke, but he didn't move, letting her observe him with that quiet intensity. She inclined her head, a slight graceful bow that seemed to say farewell, and then she vanished into the night, leaving him alone under the moon's strange greenish glow. The next evening, Isaac felt a mix of anticipation and hope as he waited in the same clearing, his eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of her. The forest was alive with its usual sounds, a symphony of soft rustlings and melodic hums from the flora around him. But she didn't appear, and he was beginning to wonder if he'd ever see her again. Just as he was about to turn back, there she was, almost materializing from the shadows, moving with the same quiet grace. Mira stepped forward, her eyes searching his face, and for a moment he thought he saw a flicker of hesitation, maybe even relief that he'd returned. She extended a hand, her fingers slightly curled, inviting him to walk with her. Isaac's heart beat faster, and he fell into step beside her as they moved through the forest, the Jade Moon lighting their path. He felt as though they were the only two souls on this entire world, isolated under the planet's green luminescence. They walked for what felt like hours until they reached a small, natural pool glowing with bioluminescent algae. Mira knelt beside it, cupping her hands in the water and watching as the light rippled across her fingers. She looked back at him and gestured for him to join her, eyes bright with excitement. Isaac followed, kneeling beside her, cupping his own hands in the water. The algae glowed against his skin, and Mira laughed, a sound that was soft and sweet, filled with the same fascination he felt. She gestured to herself, then to the water, and Isaac realized she was trying to explain something. He watched as she dipped her fingers into the pool, then ran her glowing fingertips over her face, the algae leaving a shimmering trail on her skin. It was like she was painting herself in the colors of the moon. With a smile, Isaac dipped his own fingers into the water and mirrored her, tracing a faint green line across his cheek. Mira's laughter grew, and she reached out, carefully adjusting his glowing marks until they mirrored her own. She leaned back to observe her work, nodding approvingly, her eyes shining with a playful delight he hadn't seen before. But then her expression turned serious. Mira took his hand once more, and Isaac felt a sudden pull of intensity as her fingertips glided over his palm. She was looking at him with a question in her eyes, one he didn't quite understand. Her hand rose to his chest, just above his heart, and she let it rest there, her gaze searching his face as though she were trying to decipher a hidden language. Isaac's heart thudded under her touch, and he held his breath, afraid to break the spell. "Mira," he whispered, unsure of what he wanted to say, yet compelled to speak. She leaned in close, her face inches from his, and he felt her breath, soft, warm, and strangely comforting, brush against his skin. Her lips curved into a gentle smile, and then, in a single fluid movement, she pressed her lips to his cheek. It was a simple touch, yet it held a depth that took him by surprise. His skin tingled where she'd kissed him, as if she'd left a part of herself imprinted there. A flicker of light in the distance caught her attention, and Mira pulled back, her face clouding with worry. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes filled with urgency. Isaac realized in that moment that her people were nearby, and she didn't want to be discovered with him. With one last look, Mira touched his face, her expression filled with a longing that mirrored his own. Then she rose, her figure slipping into the shadows as she disappeared into the forest. Back at camp, Isaac was quiet, lost in thought. His teammates had noticed his absences and began to ask questions, their concern evident. Dr. Lee, in particular, seemed suspicious, her sharp gaze missing little as she watched him. "Isaac, you've been disappearing every night," she said quietly one evening, pulling him aside. "Is there something or someone out there?" He hesitated, knowing that admitting the truth could jeopardize not only his mission, but also the delicate bond he'd forged with Mira. Yet Dr. Lee's concern was genuine, and he couldn't lie to her completely. "There's someone," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight he hadn't felt before. "She's one of them, a native. I've been meeting her each night." Dr. Lee's eyes widened, her gaze darting between him and the forest. "Isaac, that's incredible and risky. If the rest of her people find out—" "I know," he interrupted, a hint of desperation in his tone. "But there's something special about her, Hannah. She's not just a curiosity, she's different." Dr. Lee's expression softened, and she placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Just be careful, Isaac. For both of your sakes." He nodded, grateful for her understanding, and later that night, when the Jade Moon was at its peak, he slipped away once more into the forest, hoping that Mira would be there, waiting for him. That night, when he found her again, she seemed different, more reserved, her gaze searching his face with an intensity that made his heart ache. She didn't speak, but her eyes held a question, one that felt heavier than before. Slowly Mira reached up, pressing her hand to her chest, then extended it to him, her fingers trembling slightly. Understanding the gesture, Isaac placed his hand over her own heart, feeling the subtle thrum of her pulse. They stood there, bound by a connection that words couldn't capture, a silent exchange that spoke of trust, curiosity, and a growing bond that defied explanation. Isaac leaned closer, his forehead resting against hers, their breaths mingling as they stood together under the moon's jade glow. In that moment, they both knew that they'd found something rare, something that went beyond cultural barriers or the distance between stars. It was a feeling neither of them fully understood, yet both were willing to explore, but they also knew, deep down, that their time together was limited. Soon, Isaac would have to leave, and Mira would return to her people. The future was uncertain, but for now, under the Jade Moon, they had each other, and that was enough.